Have all mechanical inventions truly lessened the burden of daily human labor? This is a question for which every person may offer a different answer, an answer shaped by personal experience, perspective, and values. The disagreements and debates it sparks are exactly what John Stuart Mill questioned in Principles of Political Economy. When we look past appearances and examine the essence, we find that burden is a subjective concept. It varies from one individual to another, hence the divergence in opinions. But this divergence is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper truth. Those who control the means of production, capital, continually raise the threshold of what is considered laborious in order to extract more surplus value and generate greater capital accumulation. From the capitalist perspective, machines are not introduced to ease the burden on workers. Rather, they are tools to increase output and quality, reduce the price of labor, and lower the costs of variable capital. You might wonder, how exactly does mechanization reduce labor costs? Let's look at an example. Before the Industrial Revolution, Britain's textile industry relied heavily on manual labor. Production was slow, costly, and inconsistent. But with the advent of machines, textile output skyrocketed, costs dropped, and product quality became more standardized. Capitalists earned immense profits. Yet this technological progress did not benefit the workers. On the contrary, it led to widespread unemployment among artisans and craftspeople, whose manual skills were replaced by automatic looms. Many lost their livelihoods and were forced into factories, where they became mere appendages to machines, accepting lower wages and harsher working conditions. Machines also reduced the skill barrier for labor. The use of industrial equipment simplified and standardized the production process. Workers no longer needed to master complex skills. Repetitive tasks were enough to match what once required a master craftsman. This shift enabled capitalists to hire workers from lower-paid demographics, including women and children, which further suppressed the value of labor. While we may believe that all technological progress aims to elevate human civilization, the transition between old and new technologies often creates regulatory vacuums. These voids, lacking systems of protection or oversight, have led to some of the darkest chapters in labor history. A time when machines were valued more than human lives, an era marked by exploitation and oppression. This context brings us to the third stage of Das Kapital. If the first two volumes were steeped in abstract theory, covering topics such as the transformation from commodity to money, the dual nature of labor, absolute and relative surplus value, and the organic composition of capital, then this third phase serves as a bridge between theory and brutal reality. It's more accessible but profoundly heavier, for it documents case after case of exploitation. Marx writes that when capital arrives in the world, it is dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. Child labor and exploitation of women, terms that may sound shocking and distant to us today, were once rallying cries in 18th and 19th century Britain. The first slogan of capital upon introducing machines was to employ women and children. This grotesque maxim subjected entire families, regardless of gender or age, to the direct domination of capital. It expanded the labor pool and forced all family members into the wage system, performing mandatory labor for the capitalist class. If we look more closely, we see that machinery devalued male labor. Why? Because the introduction of machines not only brought every member of the working class household into the labor market, but also quietly created a mechanism of competition and division. It subtly lowered the socially necessary labor time, enabling capital to extract more value from surplus labor time. Consider this. Before machines, men and women often had complementary labor roles. Each possessed unique skills that required significant time to master, a kind of technical barrier. But machines shattered that barrier. Repetitive, mechanized processes could now produce stable, uniform goods. Anyone with minimal training could replicate what once took years to learn. This change undermined the distinct labor advantages of both genders. On top of that, capital began promoting slogans like "women are just as capable, if not more so, than men," to sow division and incite rivalry between men and women. This artificial conflict, disguised as empowerment, conveniently shifted public attention away from the true source of exploitation. Beneath this illusion of competition lies a sobering reality. What once took 4 working days to complete by hand now requires only 1. Yet instead of enjoying more rest, workers faced lengthened workdays and heightened labor intensity. As competition grew fiercer, socially necessary labor time shrank further, and surplus value increased. Men and women, once complementary forces in production, became adversaries, while capitalists watched from the shadows, greedily feeding on the lifeblood of both. In the end, the question of whether machines ease our burden must consider who benefits from their use and at whose expense. Without structural safeguards and genuine equity, innovation can easily become just another tool of domination. Let's go deeper. The dark machinery of capital and the creation of the surplus population. When we examine more closely, we find that the entire capitalist mode of production is built on one foundational principle. The worker sells their labor power as a commodity. Division of labor under this system leads to the fragmentation of the worker's capabilities, reducing them to possessing only specialized skills for operating specific tools. But once those tools are taken over by machines, the exchange value of labor vanishes alongside its use value. Like coins that no longer circulate, these workers become unsellable. At that point, a portion of the working class is transformed by machines into what Marx called the surplus population, people no longer directly needed for capital's self-expansion. Put simply, those who opposed mechanized production were reduced to helpless vassals of capital. Stripped of the means to survive, they entered a one-sided war against mechanization, a war that could only end in slow or sudden ruin. In 19th century Britain, many families survived on just a few pence per day, enduring a slow, grinding descent into poverty. In other cases, such as in British-ruled East India, the collapse was swift and catastrophic. As Marx recorded in Capital between 1834 and 1835, this devastation was so extreme that even the Governor-General acknowledged it was nearly unprecedented in commercial history. The corpses of India's textile workers, wiped out by British machine-made imports, whitened the plains of India. Greed unchecked continued to erode humanity and worsen depression. Gradually, capitalists turned their gaze toward children. In that era, local British newspapers often published advertisements like this: seeking 12 to 20 boys, appearance 13 years or older, wages 4 shillings per week, apply at name of employer. Notice the phrasing, appearance 13 years, not age 13 years. That subtle distinction matters. According to the Factory Acts at the time, children under 13 could only work 6 hours a day, and their age had to be certified by a qualified doctor. To sidestep this law, factory owners sought children who looked 13, even if they weren't. This gave rise to a shady industry of age falsification, a quiet conspiracy between doctors, parents, and factory owners. As Marx documented, the number of under 13 children employed in factories would periodically drop sharply, not because fewer were being hired, but because more were being falsely declared older. Factory inspectors themselves testified that many qualified doctors lied about children's ages, driven by capitalists' hunger for cheap labor and parents' desperation to survive. In London's infamous Bethnal Green district, every Monday and Tuesday morning, an open child labor market took place. Children as young as 9 rented themselves out to silk factories. The standard terms, 1 shilling and 8 pence to the parents, 2 pence to the doctor. The contract? A single week, renewable at will. To us today, in a world that values child protection and rights, such stories are appalling. How could parents hand over their children to such cruelty? But in the grim shadow of capitalism's dominance, these horrors were merely the tip of the iceberg. This is what Marx called the alienation of capital, a process that strips people of their morality, turning even the most sacred human relationships into transactional, exploitative exchanges. Families rented out their children for less than £3 a week to anyone willing to pay. And what about the law? In that time, for many, survival came before legality. It's estimated that over 2,000 children were sold by their own parents to work as chimney sweeps. Even when factory laws restricted child labor and regulated industries to just 6 hours per day, factory owners complained. Some parents would withdraw their children from regulated sectors and sell them instead to free labor zones, industries where laws were openly ignored. In these sectors, children under 13 were forced to work just like adults, and because of their age, they fetched a higher price. If this already sounds grotesque and heartbreaking, prepare yourself, because what follows in the historical record is even more infuriating. The deepening tragedy behind capitalism, decline of civilization, death of childhood, and the chains of ignorance. At first, people in that era attributed the high child mortality rates to diseases from roses or illnesses unique to the damp, swampy lowlands. But in 1861, an official medical report revealed a more disturbing truth. Beyond environmental factors, the key reasons for the alarming mortality rate included mothers leaving home to work, poor care of children, and even malicious abuse. Children were deliberately starved, deprived of basic nutrition from infancy. Even more horrifying, many were regularly fed opium-based syrups to keep them quiet or sedated. In some cases, mothers became emotionally detached from their own children, violating natural instincts, and intentionally starved or poisoned them. In 16 registration districts of England, the average annual death rate among infants under 1 year old was 9,085 per 100,000 births. When a mother feels no love for her child and sees them merely as a burden, such a society is destined to be tragic. As Marx wrote, married women working alongside young boys and girls in the gang labor system were leased by contractors, known as gangmasters, to landlords. These gangs often worked several miles from their home villages and could be seen on the roads at dawn and dusk. Women, wearing short skirts and jackets, sometimes even trousers, appeared strong and vigorous, but their moral sensibilities had been eroded by long exposure to hardship. They came to embrace this lifestyle without considering its devastating consequences on the frail children left behind at home. This also explains why in many Western films and dramas, we often see farmhands engaging in promiscuous behavior in stables or barns. During that dark period, dignity, morality, and humanity had been stripped away. Only primitive desire remained. Under long-term oppression, sex became the only outlet for emotional expression. From the surface, it may have seemed like society was advancing through technology. But when we dig deeper, we see that civilization was in fact regressing. This regression was most clearly reflected in one domain: education, because the path to social mobility was deliberately sealed off. Let's be clear, this ignorance wasn't natural, it was manufactured. Natural ignorance is temporary. It doesn't rob someone of their potential to grow, but manufactured ignorance deliberately blocks development. It ensures people never realize they are being exploited. That's why capitalists in that era resisted educational reform at every turn. They conspired to weaken, avoid, or outright sabotage education laws. Government attempts to introduce public education were marred by corruption and lack of enforcement, turning these reforms into empty words on paper. Before the revised Factory Act of 1844, school attendance records were often signed by a cross, drawn by teachers themselves because many teachers were illiterate. This is not an isolated case. It reflects a system where neither students nor educators had access to real learning. These tangled conditions created a society where hunger ruled, education was useless, and knowledge had no value. A piece of paper with writing on it couldn't feed you. Time spent learning was seen as wasted, better used figuring out how to slack off at work without getting caught. The few children who did receive an education were typically the offspring of factory owners. And even among the working class, those rare individuals who recognized the importance of knowledge often, over time, became part of the capitalist class themselves, joining the ranks of exploiters. Thus, through deliberate manipulation, the class structure solidified and a cycle of self-reinforcing inequality was formed. You might ask, how did this cycle reinforce itself? In such an environment, access to meaningful education was almost impossible. Even if a working-class child became aware of how valuable knowledge was, everyone around them, parents included, would mock, discourage, or suppress any attempts to pursue it. That suppression often took the form of practical reasoning. Instead of wasting time reading, why don't you produce more goods, help your family, and ease our burdens? Studying was deemed a luxury, daydreaming. As time passed, those children grew into adults, ignorant of what we now call morality, responsibility, or love, but driven by the biological impulse to reproduce, they became parents themselves. And so the cycle continued. Here lies a brutal truth. No need for exams or interrogations. The system could indoctrinate people into mental servitude through ideas alone. As we discussed in our earlier Sartre episode, hell is other people. So let us remind ourselves, we must view ourselves clearly and honestly, never underestimate our worth, and always strive to understand others with clarity and compassion. Respecting others, becoming human, and the self-destruction of capitalism. To be human is to respect others, but more crucially, it is to correctly understand the judgments and evaluations others make about you. Because between every person lies a veil of imagination, a barrier of perception. People view you through the lens of their own subjectivity, projecting their own narrative onto your existence. Yet no one in this world knows you better than yourself. If you cannot properly handle others' opinions, those opinions will eventually become your personal hell. As time passed, capitalists gradually discovered a paradox. On the one hand, they amassed and expanded capital through the exploitation of labor. On the other hand, this very exploitation began to destroy the foundation that supported it, the endless supply of cheap labor. Alarming rates of death, injury, and disability, especially among women and children, forced the British government to begin addressing the basic rights and protections of workers. To compel capitalist production to establish even the most minimal standards of hygiene and public health, the state had to intervene. In 1840, an investigative committee exposed horrifying facts that sent shockwaves across Europe. Parliament, cornered by conscience and public outrage, reluctantly passed the Mines Act of 1842. But even this law merely prohibited women and children under 10 from working underground. Only after fierce criticism from all corners of Europe did a stream of further legislation follow. The old form of capitalist production had reached its limit, but this was far from the end. A new and even more brutal form of exploitation was quietly emerging. Capitalists began to study these laws carefully. They realized that while factory legislation improved the integration of production with social and material conditions, it also exposed the deep internal contradictions of capitalism more clearly. The acceleration of capital accumulation and the socialization of production made the system's core conflict, socialized production versus private capital ownership, ever more pronounced. This intensifying contradiction was not only the trigger for the collapse of old exploitative systems, but also the seedbed for a new social order. The class struggle of the proletariat was the inevitable response to this crisis. Thus, capitalism began its next evolutionary stage, dual conquest of both industry and land. In plain language, this meant expanding the targets of extraction and domination. This transformation is what textbooks refer to as large-scale industry. It first manifested in the destruction of rural fortresses, the traditional peasant economy. In the old society, peasants relied on family-based subsistence farming and manual labor. But under capitalism, peasants were transformed into wage laborers. The capitalist system shattered the age-old bond between agriculture and handicraft, reshaping the very fabric of rural life. The divide between town and countryside blurred as rural class tensions began to mirror those of urban industrial centers. Most significantly, peasants lost control over land and means of production. At a deeper level, while capitalism tore apart the traditional links between agriculture and craft, it also paved the way for a new, more advanced integration, a union of agriculture and industry. This integration, built on science and machinery, made farming increasingly dependent on industrial inputs like machinery, chemical fertilizers, and mass-produced tools. But beware, this development is not purely positive. There must be limits, and capital has a tendency to intentionally obscure those limits. As a result, traditional ecological balance was lost. Exploitation of land and labor intensified under the illusion of progress. In short, capitalism cloaked the destruction of land-human relations under a beautiful slogan, but its cost was ecological devastation. Mass labor concentration depleted soil nutrients which could no longer return to the earth through traditional regenerative cycles. Although productivity seemed to rise on the surface, it came at a steep cost: the long-term degradation of land and the health of laborers. This is where we understand the meaning of the phrase, "Mountains of gold and silver are not as precious as green hills and clear waters." Because green hills and clean water represent long-term sustainability, ecological health, and the well-being of future generations, values that far outweigh short-term profits. But capitalism sees things differently. It doesn't care about long-term outcomes. It is fixated only on immediate gain. As a result, farmers became sacrificial offerings on the altar of capital accumulation. Their tools ceased to be extensions of their labor and instead became instruments of domination and exploitation. Due to the unique nature of agriculture, rural workers were scattered across vast lands, making collective resistance extremely difficult. In contrast, urban workers, living and laboring in more concentrated environments, were better positioned to unite. This contrast illustrates not only the economic mechanics of exploitation, but also how geography and labor distribution shape the capacity for resistance, and why, in the long arc of history, class struggle remains the pulse of social change. The illusion of progress and the inescapable cycles of history. As previously discussed, the implementation of worker protection laws in Britain was not uniform. They were rolled out in cities first, and only gradually extended to rural areas. This staggered enforcement gave capitalists a critical window to exploit agricultural workers with little to no regulation. And the consequences of this disparity were severe. Rural workers, already vulnerable due to geographic isolation, were left even more powerless under capitalist pressure. Compounding this vulnerability was the stark difference in education. Many agricultural laborers lacked the necessary knowledge or critical perspective to discern whether the so-called progress promoted by capitalists was genuine advancement or simply exploitation under a more appealing name. While this may sound abstract to some, those who have studied political economy or public administration will instantly recognize the gravity and complexity of the issue. To make this more relatable, let's use a metaphor. It is often easy to identify enemies who openly oppose us, those who argue, resist, or stand in direct conflict. But far more difficult is recognizing the enemies who live among us, who appear aligned with our goals, who offer flattery and affirmation, yet reinforce only a narrow, one-sided version of our identity. These individuals are the most deceptive because human nature instinctively favors praise over criticism, affirmation over challenge. This psychological bias creates a dangerous feedback loop. Without adequate education or exposure to systemic thinking, rural workers are often unable to perceive the deeper consequences at play. All they see is a capitalist arriving with a strange new machine that miraculously doubles their crop yield. Yes, prices per unit may be lower, but they now have more to sell than ever before. In their eyes, the capitalist becomes a savior, a benefactor. Anyone who tries to reveal the underlying reality or criticize this system is immediately met with resistance. You just don't want to see us doing better, or you're afraid our increased output will take away your share. And if you attempt to explain the long-term harms using proper economic theory or systemic analysis, the typical response is dismissive. Don't talk to me about theories. I don't understand that stuff. Any idea that helps us grow more food is a good idea. This inversion of values, where short-term static outcomes are treated as absolute truth, and long-term, dynamic development is dismissed as pointless theory, is one of the most subtle forms of capitalist discipline. It conditions people to see the immediate present as the only reality that matters, rendering the broader, slower, and more complex patterns of change invisible or irrelevant. In this way, capitalism gains a natural shield, one built not from laws or violence, but from psychological conditioning. The heart of the problem lies here. Subjective human nature often outweighs objective developmental truth. And with this, we reach the end of our discussion. When we step back and reflect on the entire trilogy of Das Kapital, we begin to notice a striking pattern. When you begin studying economics, you soon realize you're actually studying politics. When you study politics, you discover you are really studying history. When you study history, you find it is in fact philosophy. And when you study philosophy, you realize that at its core lies the intricate, messy tangle of human nature. Once you combine all these layers and adopt a God's eye perspective to objectively examine the entire developmental process, one term becomes clear: cyclical fluctuation. Or to put it more plainly, the only lesson humanity has ever learned from history is that we have never truly learned anything from history at all.